Hello class and welcome to Human Resource Management. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about human resources and pre-employment interviewing. So let's get started. I'm kind of working on the assumption that everyone here has had a job, and as part of that job, they've engaged in the interviewing process. So we all have a basic idea of what an interview is and what it's used for. So in this lecture, we're going to go a little bit more in depth with that and kind of talk about some of the formal or structured components underneath it that HR managers need to be aware of. So first off, the interviewing comes after we've got a pool of candidates that we've identified as being qualified. And we use the interviewing process to further weed down that process. So in general, the interviewing process is considered to be a weeding out tool. It's a tool that's used to reduce the number of people in our applicant pool that to a smaller number, and perhaps even to the number to the individual or set of individuals that will receive the job. And the interviewing process generally consists of meeting with a manager, an HR manager, could be the hiring manager, and they're gonna basically engage in a conversation. This conversation will consist of questions, actions, behaviors, all designed to help understand or assess the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the candidate. So right here you see that we have an initial screening interview. Let's say most of the college graduates, are graduating from college and they're applying for full-time jobs. So they engage in interviews with HR. And before the company invests money in flying the candidate out to wherever the location is or pulling hiring managers away from their day-to-day work, they want to make sure the interviewer, that the candidate has some basic skills. So you have what's called a screening interview. This interview may last about maybe 15, 20 minutes. It's typically done by an HR manager who has little to nothing to do with the actual job, and they're following a very structured manner when it comes to asking questions and conducting the interview. Okay, so a lot of times in these interviews, the candidate is trying to develop rapport and a sense of connection with the interviewer, and they feel it's very difficult to do so. And that should be expected because these are highly structured interviews that are put on by the HR department. So this person is not particularly interested in developing a rapport with you. What they're interested in doing is asking a set of questions, generally speaking, a set of questions they're going to ask everyone that they're doing screening interviews of. They're going to collect and then analyze that information to try to identify which candidates should move on to the next stage in the process. So while it's important to do well in this interview, trying to develop rapport, getting to know the HR manager extremely well, generally is difficult to do and offers little benefit. Then you have what's called in-depth interviews, and these usually take place a little bit later on in the whole employee selection process. And more in-depth interviews are typically had by the hiring manager or the person you're going to work for. And it's not uncommon that when you do come on site and you're going to do a face-to-face, or it could be nowadays, a Zoom call or something online, that you would also interview with other people that would be on your team that you would work with, or other people that may be recipients of the work that you would produce. So you may engage in 6 or 7 in-depth interviews over the process of a day or two. They also may take you out to lunch. And you should also be aware that even when you're at lunch and it's not quote unquote a formal interview, you should be aware that you're being assessed even at that time as well. But the whole purpose of having interviews is to assess or evaluate the qualifications of the applicant to make sure you're bringing on the person who has the best KSAs, meaning that the KSAs most perfectly as possible line up with the TDRs or the task duties and responsibilities of the job. With that said, there are 4 types of interviews that people can engage in. There's actually more, but in this slide we're just talking about 4. You got the biographical interview, the behavioral interview, the competency interview, and situational interview. You should know the difference between each of these. Really quickly, the biographical interview basically focuses on a person's history, their biography, so to speak, or their resume. So most of the interview questions in this type of interview are going to come directly from your resume, and they're going to focus on past work experience. Behavioral interviews focus on how you behave in certain situations, your actions. So you may find yourself, a good example of this would be like a lunch interview. So you're going out to lunch, or the company's taking you out to lunch. So you come in for 3 interviews, then you go out to lunch, and then you finish the day up with 3 interviews. Well, during that lunchtime, believe it or not, you're being evaluated as well. Your behaviors, your actions, your mannerisms. In your typical in-depth interviews, your behaviors and mannerisms are being watched as well. Okay, so but here we really want to know how you're going to behave, and we may create various situations to really assess how well the candidate behaves in different types of conditions. But we're looking at your actions that you specifically perform, not necessarily your history, for example, that we'd find on your resume. The next type of interview would be a competency interview. The purpose of these interviews is to really assess your knowledge, skills, and ability, to determine how authentic they are and how strong they are. So let's say I'm hiring somebody to do some coding or web development. I may bring them in as part of the interviewing process. I have them actually code some documents or build a web page for me. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm testing their competency. How well do you really know your material? How well do you know this information? And how well can you implement it? The last type of interview here is called a situational interview. And a situational interview basically focuses on, it's kind of like a behavioral interview, but it focuses on how you're going to behave or act or handle yourself in various situations. So we may create a stressful situation in order to see how you're going to handle it. A lot of times, situational interviews are done via paper. You may take a test or an exam or some type of written component, or if it's face-to-face, they may ask you certain questions. So they may ask you situational questions. What would you do when faced with this type of situation? Let's say it's a retail store position, that customer service position that we're trying to hire for. And during the interview process, whether it's written or face-to-face, you may get questions like, a very dissatisfied customer came to you and complained that the product they just purchased was damaged. How would you handle this situation? The person is very rude and they're engaging in all sorts of vulgarity. How would you go about calming this customer down and turning this into a win-win situation for you, for the company and the customer? That'd be an example of a situational type of interview question. 2 important components associated with interviewing. One is the degree of structure that the interviewing technique involves. And then the other is the validity. So validity is super important because that tells you that your questions or your technique is valid and that you're getting information that pertains to the construct that you're trying to evaluate. So for example, if you're trying to evaluate a person's leadership skills, is the technique and the questions you're answering, are those directly correlated or positively correlated to the leadership construct? So it's really important that you have interviews that are very valid. Okay, so here we have a list of types of interviews, and we have these 2 components, degree of structure and validity. Structure means that the interview is the same for every person. That is very formalized, the same questions, the same technique, the same approach. Everything is being done exactly the same for each candidate. And this is beneficial because it allows you to evaluate candidates fairly across the board. If every candidate answered the same question, if every interview lasted the same amount of time, if the same people were doing the interviews or people who were trained, they received the same training who were doing the interviews, then you could pretty much say, hey, I have apples to apples information. I can make accurate comparisons. So that's why structured interviews are really helpful and beneficial. When we look at the type of interviews, we can see that biographical interviews are the most structural. And if you go back to our definition before, these are interviews that are based off a person's resume. So we can craft specific questions that we ask every candidate. We can write those questions down, and it's easy to understand the flow of the interview, what happened, and to evaluate candidates' answers one to another. So it's very high in terms of structure. And also in terms of validity, we can ask questions that have been established to have great validity in terms of predicting a person's leadership ability, their communication style, or their competency in a particular area. As we go along, kind of down this list, we see that the interviews become less and less structure, have less and less structure. They also become less and less valid. There are, what we have at the very bottom is called a non-directive interview, and this is perhaps the most unstructured and non-valid way of conducting an interview, and yet some people still engage in it. Also, you should note that having interviews with great degree of structure and validity help provide assurances against discrimination claims, okay? Because you asked everybody the same information, they were all evaluated the same way, and you were evaluating constructs that were definitely related to the employment situation or the job that a person is being hired to. A non-directive interview is different in that you may ask the candidate a question. They give you an answer. Based off of their answer, you derive or pick another question to ask them. And it's kind of like this branch of a tree, so to speak. And the interview can go in any number of different ways depending on the questions that you answer and the answers that they give. So you could imagine if two candidates were being interviewed, even if they're being interviewed by the same person, the content, the information you gather is going to be vastly different for each candidate. So for example, tell me about a time when you were faced to make a tough decision and how did you go about making that decision? The candidate gives the answer and then the interviewer says, well, hey, that's really interesting. Tell me a little bit more about XYZ. And then based off that answer, they derive the next question. And it goes on like that until the interview is done. This is perhaps the most it's useful in terms of getting to know the candidate perhaps, but in terms of being able to fairly evaluate candidates against each other, this is perhaps the most least useful interviewing technique. Here we're going to talk about structured interviews. And we're going to talk about some of the benefits of having a structured interview. There's three specific ones. First, you obtain the information that you need. You identify that information in advance, and you get that information that you need, and you get it from each candidate. It's incredibly consistent. Number two, it's more reliable than other interview formats. And you can kind of go back to what we talked about in the previous slide to understand that. But we can test it. We can make sure that the constructs that we're testing for, say leadership or communication or ability to code a document, we can make sure that the questions we're asking are predictable. They're very valid when it comes to predicting a person's behavior on the outcome, which is their leadership in the job or their communication, so on and so forth. And it also empowers you to meet EEO guidelines. Like I said before, it protects you from lawsuits that could be particularly damaging to the organization. On our previous slide, I described for you what a non-directive interview is. We'll spend just a little bit more time talking about non-directive and stress interviews here on this slide. So a non-directive interview, as I mentioned before, where questions are developed based off of the answers to previous questions, okay? So you run a high risk of not getting the information that you need, and you have absolutely zero sense of validity in terms of your ability to predict a person's behavior on certain attributes that may be important to the job, okay? A lot of times the information you get is not going to be job related, and it's going to be highly unique to individuals. So this is perhaps the worst form of interviewing to use. Stress interviews are designed, they're interviews that are designed to cause the candidate, anxiety, to put pressure on them to see how they respond. So some examples of stress interview techniques would be a panel interview. So this is where the candidate may stand in front of 5 or 6 to 9 individuals, and those individuals are simply firing out interview questions, and the candidate has to handle those interview questions. Okay, and what they're really looking for to see how well can you handle. One of the things you're looking for, I should say, is to see how well you handle yourself under pressure. You can imagine this could be a useful technique if you're interviewing a person to be a consultant, because as a consultant, you're going to be responsible for presenting in front of clients, and sometimes those clients may be supportive, and other times they may be hostile. And the company needs to know that you can handle yourself in both environments. Some other interview formats, as I mentioned earlier, you have the panel interview format and the team interview format. So the panel interview format is basically where you're meeting with a number of people at the same time, and each of them are allowed to ask you questions when they're ready. So this can be a very intimidating format because it could seem almost like it's a 7-on-1 type of setup. And generally, this can very easily fall under the category of a stress interview. And part of what they're watching for is your behavior in these interviews. How do you handle it? Team interviews, this is where you're interviewed by every team member. This is extremely popular. It happens a lot, particularly when you get to those middle management jobs in corporate America. And what happens is that you made it through the initial screening, you're deemed to be a worthy candidate. Typically, when they get to this stage, they're bringing in 2 to 3 candidates, and they're going to make the final hiring decision from one of those. So if you get to the stage where you're being flown in and you're going to meet with the hiring manager and also the team that you'll be working with, this is a very good sign that you're probably going to get the job. So when you're having a team interview, you may meet with the manager or meet with HR, and then you may have 3 or 4 interviews set up following, and each interview you're going to is with someone that you would literally work with if you were hired. So generally speaking, the team members may interview you, but they don't make the final decision. The final decision is 95% of the time made by the hiring manager. What happens is that after the various team members have interviewed you, the hiring manager may call a meeting with everyone on the team and then debrief and get their feelings, their impressions about you as a candidate and what they think about you. Would you make a good person to work with? It's important to note that individuals participating in team interviews are not trained interviewers. So they may engage in any host of interviewing techniques because they're not trained. Generally speaking, they're not trained. They're just individuals who work in a job who know they may get a new team member and they're being asked to evaluate you. So, developing a connection with these individuals is very important and can go a long ways to helping you get the job. But do remember, it is always 95% of the time the hiring manager's decision who gets the job. Once a hiring manager makes their decision, they will oftentimes run the decision up the chain of command and get permission from the director or the vice president, who then may question them, why did you pick this person, so on and so forth. You may even interview with the director or the vice president, but the decision ultimately lies in the hands of the hiring manager. Once a hiring manager kind of gets sign off from his or her superiors, then an offer can be made. And generally speaking, the superiors, the director or the vice president, they tend to rely on or support the decision of the hiring manager. The general premise is that if I brought you in as a hiring manager, then I brought you in because I trust your judgment. And if I trust your judgment, then I believe you can make the right decision when it comes to building out your own team. I do not want and should not be micromanaging you on the decisions of people you hire onto your team, because I have faith in you, because I brought you onto my team. Effective interviewing. If you're an interviewer and you're going to conduct an interview with a candidate, there are some things that you should be aware of. Right? First off, you want to plan the interview. Don't go into an interview unplanned. You want to have written out any kind of questions you want to ask. You should have the topics or the elements of the job that you're trying to measure. You should know all that stuff. You should have a good idea of the job. You should have that person's resume, their background information. You should have reviewed it prior to the interview. So you're going into the interview prepared. Next, you as the interviewer want to maintain control of the interview. The candidate there most likely is going to be fairly humble and acquiesce to the interviewer's control. So if you're not in control and the candidate is acquiescing to your control, you could have a very confusing situation. So know that you as an interviewer, you're the person in control. You should guide things. Make sure you tell them when to start, when to stop. Let the person know what they could expect during the interview process with you, then conduct the interview. And then use effective questioning techniques. Here are some question techniques that you should definitely avoid, right? So avoid yes-no questions. Avoid asking obvious questions. When you ask a yes-no question or a binary question, that's all they may give you is yes or no, and you don't get the contextual information that you're really seeking for that would help you get a better idea of this person and their abilities. So avoid yes-no questions. Instead of saying, did you go to the store yesterday? Yes or no. You can say something about, how was your walk to the store? Or how does it feel when you go to the store? Or you can say something like, when going to the store, what approach do you use to shop and to pick out goods? Okay, you can use questions that are open-ended. Don't ask obvious questions because people are going to give you the obvious answer. They're there to impress you. So they're not going to say anything that's typically bad about themselves or other people, because generally speaking, engaging in that kind of behavior is frowned upon, and it makes you look kind of bad and petty. So tell me, have you ever lied to your manager before? That's an obvious question. Even if they did lie to their manager before, they're going to lie to you right now, right? They're going to say, no, I didn't. Questions that are rarely produce a truthful answer, just stay away from them. Do not ask leading questions. Leading questions are basically when you're telling a person what you want to hear when you're asking the question. So you may say something to the fact of, leadership is very important in our company. How important is leadership to you? Well, obviously the correct answer is going to be, leadership is very important to me. Do not ask illegal questions. Now, these illegal questions doesn't mean you're going to go to jail, but they're questions that can lead to revealing a person's membership in a protected class. And now when you open that Pandora's box and the person doesn't get the job, you can give them cause to engage in lawsuits for discrimination. So questions like, how old are you? Or, are you married? How many children do you have? Okay, questions along those lines that could, do you have any disabilities that we should be aware of? Right? Those questions they're inappropriate. We're classifying them as illegal questions, but once again, it's not illegal as in going to jail, but it's inappropriate questions. And then you should stay away from questions that are not related to the job. And once again, this opens you up to discrimination. I know this is very hard to do, particularly to untrained interviewers. And I've been in interviews that have talked about pets, cats, dogs, housing, other beliefs that have nothing to do with the job at all. But because people kind of developed a rapport, then these types of questions and topics come up in interviews. So here's an example. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but here's an example of commonly asked questions in interviews, right? Questions about motivation, questions about how people work with others, integrity, related questions. So I'd say pause the video, spend a few minutes just reading through these questions and getting a general idea of how you could frame out structured questions that you could ask of every interview candidate. Now we're going to talk about some problems with interviewing. In other words, some things that you should work hard to avoid if you're the interviewer. So first is making snap judgments. Snap judgments mean you arrive at a conclusion about an individual very quickly before you actually have all the data and information necessary to arrive at that conclusion. So for example, let's say a person comes in and their suit's a little tight. You may say, wow, if that person can't wear a proper suit to the interview, then they're not a very good decision maker. We're not going to recommend them. They may be a great candidate. They may do a great job at that particular position, but you've already made a judgment really quick. And perhaps there's some underlying cause. Maybe the person is in college and all they can afford is that one suit that they had. Okay, they recently gained some weight and now the suit's a little bit tight, but they don't have any money to go buy a new one and they're in college. So should we really hold that against them, right? I mean, they're trying to get a job so they can go out and do better for themselves. All right, so avoid making snap judgments and snap decisions. Negative emphasis. You want to be very careful about this. It is so easy to find one thing about an individual and then focus on that, particularly when we're attributing negative attributes. So you can say, man, I really do not like that brooch that she is wearing. And I place all this negative emphasis on that brooch and I kind of judge her based off of that. Okay, so negative emphasis can come in any number of ways. Why does she wear those type of shoes, right? Or, I can't believe that she didn't bring a copy of her resume with her to the job, to the job interview. So you're placing too much emphasis on one thing, and that's negative. The halo effect, this also is known as the horn effect as well, when you're kind of looking at the opposite. Halo effect means that you see an attribute about somebody or they're associated with somebody or something, and the things they're associated with, you have good feelings about. So you automatically attribute those good feelings to the candidate. For example, one of your best friends is Peter. So a guy comes in to interview and he just so happened to be Peter's roommate in college. So because you have really great feelings about Peter and you say, Peter wouldn't have a friend that has bad judgment. Therefore, your good feelings about Peter attribute over to the candidate. Well, that's not really fair. That's called the halo effect. And the same thing could be the horn effect. If you had disdain for Peter and now you're interviewing somebody that's a good friend of Peter's, you'd be like, well, they're probably just like Peter. Therefore, I'm not going to promote them in this job process. That would be called the horn effect. So you want to be careful. You want to avoid those things altogether. Biases and stereotypes, it's kind of obvious that we want to avoid those. You want to really judge a candidate off of their merit, ask some questions that are reliable, that are valid, and that actually help you measure the attributes that the job needs to be successful. So avoid your own biases and your own stereotypes. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean that everybody else should dislike it as well. And lastly, cultural noise. Many times you're going to interview people who come from different cultures. And it's very easy for us to look at a person's accent or look at the way they're dressed. This individual is wearing a hijab. So, and I don't feel comfortable with that. Therefore, they're not qualified for the job. That's a very poor behavior on your part as an interviewer. Evaluate each candidate based on his or her merit and treat them fairly. That wraps it up for this lecture. If there's any questions, be sure to send me a message and let me know. Thank you very much and have a good day.